Every generation has one. Something so normal, so woven into daily life, that nobody alive at the time can imagine it being wrong. Something that almost everyone defends as necessary. Normal. Even moral. Philosophers write papers justifying it. Doctors endorse it. Everyday people do it without a second thought because everyone around them does it too. And then, sometimes within a single generation, it flips completely. It becomes shameful, something people quietly distance themselves from. Something historians write about with that particular careful language reserved for things too ugly to look at directly. Slavery did this, dueling did this, child labor did this, foot binding did this, bloodletting did this. And there's a quiet, growing argument that one of the biggest moral flips in human history hasn't happened yet. It's sitting on your plate right now. This video is not going to tell you what to eat. That's not what this is. No guilt trip, no conversion attempt. What this is an honest look at a historical mechanism, a pattern that has repeated itself enough times that we can actually study it. And then ask a genuinely uncomfortable question. Does what we're doing right now fit that pattern? Because history is full of people who were certain they were on the right side of something, and most of them were wrong. Let's start with the mechanism itself. How does a moral flip actually happen? It almost never starts with a dramatic moment. No single speech, no single law. It starts with a crack in the logic, usually introduced by a small group of people, often considered eccentric or extreme at the time, who point at something everyone is doing and say, "We need to look at this more carefully." In 1688, a group of Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, wrote what historians now call the first formal protest against slavery in American history. It was a single page. 4 men signed it. They were largely ignored. Slavery didn't end in America for another 177 years. But the crack was there. What followed over those 177 years was a slow, grinding shift in how people thought about the question. Not the practice, the question. Whether it was even okay to ask. There's a range of ideas any society considers acceptable to discuss out loud. And what history shows repeatedly is that range moves. What's unthinkable becomes debatable. What's debatable becomes mainstream. What's mainstream becomes obvious. And what's obvious becomes the only thing anyone can believe was ever questioned. The people who lived through the shift usually can't see it happening. That's the thing. They're inside it. So what does the current picture actually look like? Here's the first thing worth saying clearly before a single number lands. Scale has never, historically, told us anything about morality. Slavery was enormous. Child labor employed hundreds of millions. The size of a practice is not an argument for its rightness. Hold on to that, because the next few numbers are going to try to overwhelm you, and overwhelm is not the same thing as an argument. Right now, humans kill more than 80 billion land animals every year for food. That's roughly 10 animals per person on the planet, every 12 months. Not over a lifetime. Every year. Add aquatic animals, and some estimates put the number above 1 trillion annually. That's a number so large it stops meaning anything, which, when you think about it, might be part of the point. Over 70% of those land animals are raised in factory farms, and a fully grown chicken in one of those operations will typically spend its entire life in a space smaller than a sheet of paper. Factory farming today is the architecture of daily life. It runs through almost every supply chain, every restaurant, every refrigerator in the developed world. And that scale tells us something. Not about whether it's wrong, but about why it's so hard to question. Every practice that has ever undergone a moral flip was so deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of its time that challenging it felt not just radical, but genuinely absurd. Like challenging the idea of eating breakfast. Slavery wasn't a fringe practice. At its peak, enslaved people represented more than half the economic output of the American South. The entire system was built around it. To suggest it was wrong wasn't just controversial, it threatened the architecture of daily life. The scale of a thing has never protected it. That's the observation. That's all it is. Here's where it gets more complicated. For most of human history, the question of whether animals could suffer in a morally meaningful way was considered settled. They couldn't. Or, if they could, not in the way that mattered. Then science started looking more carefully. In 2012, a group of prominent neuroscientists gathered at Cambridge University and publicly proclaimed what's now known as the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed in the presence of Stephen Hawking. The conclusion: non-human animals possess the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Mammals, birds, even some invertebrates. Then researchers turned to fish. In 2019, a study published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society found that fish display behaviors consistent with pain avoidance learning. They adjust future behavior to avoid experiences that previously caused them harm. That is not a reflex. A reflex doesn't require memory. A reflex doesn't require anticipation. Fish were anticipating future pain and reorganizing their behavior to avoid it. That is a different category of thing than anyone had assumed. And then there were the octopuses. Researchers documented octopuses carrying coconut shell halves, collecting them, stacking them, and later assembling them into shelters. Across the ocean floor, not one octopus, many. They were picking up objects with no immediate use, transporting them, and holding on to them for a future purpose that existed only in their minds. Tool use, planned ahead, in an animal whose last common ancestor with vertebrates was approximately 750 million years ago. The branch of life that produced octopuses and the branch that produced us separated 750 million years before the dinosaurs appeared. And somehow, independently, it arrived at planning for a future. Here's the kind of thing researchers found when they turned to land animals. A pig was placed in a room with a mirror and a hidden food bowl, visible only in the reflection. The pig used the mirror. It walked to the correct corner of the room behind a partition and found the bowl. It had looked at its own reflection, understood that the reflection was showing it something real, and acted on that information. Researchers called this assessment awareness. It's a level of cognition they hadn't expected to find. Pigs show measurable signs of depression when socially isolated. Cows form close friendships with specific individuals and show elevated stress hormones when separated from them. None of this is contested science. These findings are in peer-reviewed journals. They're cited in university textbooks. And this is the exact same kind of scientific update that has historically preceded moral shifts. Germ theory preceded changes in medical practice. Evidence of fetal development preceded changes in reproductive ethics. Neurological evidence about pain and consciousness is now preceding a quiet but growing re-examination of how we treat animals. The crack is in the logic. The question is whether it spreads. Every moral flip in history needed two things to actually happen: a change in what people knew and a change in what people could do instead. Abolitionists could not have succeeded without industrialization making enslaved labor economically replaceable. Child labor laws didn't stick until compulsory education made them enforceable, and economic development made them survivable for families. The moral argument and the practical alternative arrived together. That's what made the shift possible. Here's what's new. In 2013, a scientist named Mark Post unveiled the first lab-grown beef burger in front of a live audience in London. It cost $330,000 to produce, funded by Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google. A single patty. In 2023, the USDA granted the first ever approval of cultivated chicken, meat grown from animal cells without slaughter, for commercial sale in the United States. The price per pound had dropped by roughly 99% from that first burger. The first commercial serving happened at a 3-Michelin star restaurant in San Francisco. Chef's tasting menu. $40 a plate. That's where it started. That's always where it starts. The Good Food Institute and McKinsey both project that cultivated meat reaches price parity with conventional meat sometime between 2030 and 2032. That is the practical alternative arriving. Right now. In real time. This is the part of the pattern that most people haven't noticed yet. It's not just a moral debate. It's a moral debate that's about to have an economic answer. None of this is simple, and the people who tell you it is are not being honest with you. It's worth pausing here to be honest about something else too. A video that spends 4 chapters building a historical pattern and then says, "I'm not telling you what to eat," is asking you to trust a fairly fine distinction. So let's be precise about it. Nothing here is asking you to change your dinner tonight. What it's asking is harder to dismiss, whether you can sit with the discomfort of a question without needing to resolve it in your own favor immediately. There are hundreds of millions of people on this planet for whom reducing meat consumption is not a viable option, economically, culturally, or in terms of basic nutritional access. In parts of rural Mongolia, for instance, where arable land is scarce and herding is the primary livelihood, animal products aren't a dietary preference. They're close to the only reliable source of protein for entire communities. Moral frameworks that ignore material reality aren't moral frameworks. They're luxury opinions dressed up as ethics. The access problem is real. It deserves to be said plainly, and it deserves to be solved, not dismissed. And there is a serious argument made by serious people that human beings are biological omnivores, that meat eating is so deeply embedded in cultural identity and social ritual across almost every civilization in human history that the comparison to slavery or child labor is not just analytically wrong, but genuinely offensive. That argument is not nothing. Cultural identity is not nothing. The fact that a practice is old and widespread is not by itself a moral defense, but the human meaning woven into it deserves more than a shrug. These counterarguments deserve to be heard. Consider this. In 1837, a U.S. Senator named John C. Calhoun stood on the Senate floor and delivered what became one of the most famous defenses of slavery in American history. He didn't argue that slavery was a necessary evil. He argued it was a positive good. He made economic arguments, moral arguments. He compared it favorably to the conditions of wage laborers in Europe. He was serious. He was educated. He was considered one of the sharpest political minds of his generation, and he was completely, catastrophically wrong, in a way that took another generation of people dying in a war to settle. Here's the thing about the historical pattern. Those counter-arguments existed for every previous moral flip. They were serious. They were made by serious people. And in hindsight, the seriousness of the argument didn't protect it from the outcome. That's what makes this uncomfortable to think about, not whether you're right or wrong right now, but whether you can know from inside the moment which side of history you're standing on. Slavery did this. Dueling did this. Child labor did this. And then it flips. The people who lived through it on either side couldn't always see it happening. That's what it looks like from inside. It looks like ordinary life, like dinner, like Tuesday, like a hand resting on a table, not thinking about any of this at all. The question isn't whether you should change what you eat tonight. The question is this. 100 years from now, someone will sit in a history class and look back at this moment, at the scale, at the science, at the technology that arrived just in time. And they will feel something. That particular specific confusion we feel when we look at things people used to do and genuinely cannot understand how nobody stopped it. You are living in that moment right now. The only question is which side of it you'll be on when it's over.